So I think we need to then look at that latter bit, social workers' resistance, and need to ask why resistance is important. What are the incentives, what are the imperatives then for resistance? We have continuing stories of resource shortfalls and these perverse incentives of target-driven organisations. This very week I had a couple of stories. A student who was attempting to develop a package of care that involved ethnically sensitive meals package for somebody being, I was going to say released from hospital. You know what I mean, being discharged from hospital. And her manager actually refused this package because she said there was a perfectly decent meal service already available. And that seemed to be very much at odds with the duty to promote racial equality, for instance. And the other story that I heard today, and I hear this one over and over again, is a student who asked for a very small amount of resources from the team manager in order to prevent an informal support network for an older person living at home, to prop it up so that it didn't fall to pieces. He said, come back and see me when it's fallen to pieces. It just seems absolutely ludicrous that sort of thing is still happening in organisations in this day and age. So those resource shortfalls and perverse incentives, I think, are quite an incentive and an imperative for beginning to resist within organisations. Inequalities in service provision are still very much there. We know about the recent report about inequalities, racial inequalities, racialised inequalities in mental health services, again coming to the forefront. And some very specific examples of clashes between the statutory duties of social workers and the codes of practice and the law. So a very good example is what social workers are being required to do in working with unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, being very much at odds with the Children Act and certainly with the codes of practice. And social workers, hearing about social workers being drawn into decision-making about breaching children on ASBEs, in other words, criminalising young people. Social justice and the values of social work. Social justice is very much rooted in the values of social work. The international definition of social work, agreed by a broad range of organisations in the United Kingdom as elsewhere, says as much. And of course, there are the requirements of the codes of practice for social workers and their employers, which we'll come back to. So if we're asking or requiring, in my context, social work education, students to be critical and analytical of their practice and of their placement agencies, if that's what we're asking them to do, then we need to be enable them to be critical and analytical of those organisations. So, what are the opportunities for resistance? I'm going to go through some of these in order to give you a flavour of the opportunities that I think are there. What are the tools for critical analysis, for instance? And I'm going to pass over the legislation because I think that I've covered that to a certain degree, and to look at the codes of practice. This is not exactly radical social work, but it certainly is a clear steer to us. Employers are required to implement and monitor policies on equal opportunities. They're required to ensure employees and service users and carers know the codes. Social workers are required to protect the rights and promote the interests of users and carers, promote independence, protect from harm, and uphold the trust and confidence in social care services. So I don't think that could be really clearer. If you move on and look at the values, the value requirements for the diploma in social work, which I say is not a requirement for the new degree, but we've actually maintained it and in fact built upon it at Bath, and I think it certainly is something that's being heavily debated within social work education at the moment, how we ensure that those values are actually reflected in students' practice. And I just want to pick out some of these. Value requirement 2, to remind us, respect and value uniqueness and diversity, and recognise and build on strengths. And value requirement 5, which I think takes us to the heart of social justice and social work, identify, analyse and take action to counter discrimination, racism, disadvantage, inequality and injustice, using strategies appropriate to role and function. And hang on a minute. Whoa. what was the other one I was going to do? And the last one, yes, that's right, one of the ones that we've added is working in alliance with service users and carers to ensure that their rights and interests are taken into account when planning and carrying out social work practice. We felt that that was a really important value to build into social work practice. Critical reflective practice. I mean, I could have and perhaps should have referred you to Jan Fuchs' excellent work on critical reflection in social work practice. I picked out this this list from the book by Everett and colleagues from Applied Research for Better Practice, and just again want to pick out some of these aspects. It's important in critical reflective practice to be questioning taken for granted assumptions about the definition of problems, so the definition of need within organisations, for instance, is very often determined by eligibility criteria. There are other ways of thinking about needs which are maybe not reflected there. Recognising structural disadvantage, noting how social problems are socially structured. And finally, evaluating the legitimacy of power relationships at all levels within organisations. There's then also theory for anti-oppressive practice, and again I just kind of bundled out a list of things which I thought have been really important over this time period, in the last 30 years or whatever. But the key aspect I want to get across here is the bit in brackets. How we understand things determines how we deal with them. So that's why the theoretical underpinning to our practice is so important. And a very good example of this in relation to institutional racism is that although institutional racism had been discussed since it was raised by people within the Black Power movement in America in the late 60s, it was not kind of firmly established as a theoretical perspective to explain racism in this country. There was an opportunity during the Scarman inquiry into the Brixton riots, when Scarman was presented with a lot of evidence of institutionalised racism within the police service, and he actually rejected that idea. He said there were some bad apples in the police service, and because that was rejected, it meant that the Metropolitan Police Service only had to deal with those bad apples, those few bad apples. It didn't have to deal with the fundamental institutionalised racism within the organisation. When McPherson came along, he listened to exactly the same arguments, and he was persuaded by those. And the rest, as they say, is history. We had the McPherson report having a definition of institutionalised racism, which has been built into the subsequent legislation, the duty to promote racial equality, the importance of having impact assessments within organisation, public bodies, to ensure that unwitting racism doesn't continue and within our organisations.